My name is Sue. I am a nurse at St. Mary's General Hospital. I never imagined I would experience something like this. Early this morning, the hospital director gathered all the staff to give us an urgent notice. A pandemic had been declared. They didn't know exactly how the virus spread, but the government had taken drastic measures. Police officers and soldiers had been sent to guard the hospital, and most unsettling of all, we were given special injections. We didn't know what they contained, but we had to take them immediately. They told us they were to protect us, but no one explained how they worked. There was no time for questions. Within a few hours, patients with the same symptoms began arriving. Extreme exhaustion that forced them to lie down anywhere. At first, we thought it was a severe flu, but it clearly wasn't. Some could barely stay awake as we attended to them. In less than 2 hours, the first patients were already in a deep sleep. We tried to wake them up, but nothing worked. The hospital quickly filled up. The hallways were lined with makeshift stretchers and even couches where people simply collapsed. The most terrifying thing was the murmuring. They didn't scream in pain or delirium from fever. They just slept and occasionally mumbled things. The soldiers secured the emergency exits and checked everyone who entered. The emergency room turned into chaos, with people desperately pleading for help for their loved ones. Some patients arrived in ambulances. Others were brought in forcefully by family members. Many cried and begged us to wake them up. But nothing worked. Doctors tried analyzing the blood of the infected, but everything seemed normal. Communication with other hospitals was confusing. They were all collapsing just like us. Some nurses tried to go home, but the soldiers wouldn't let them leave. No one was allowed to leave the hospital until further notice. By the afternoon, the hospital was already overwhelmed. We converted operating rooms into care areas, but they too soon filled up. There were no screams, no evident pain, just lifeless bodies breathing slowly. The television showed images of empty streets and overwhelmed hospitals in other cities. The presenters spoke about staying calm, but their voices trembled. Nurses and doctors gathered in a corner of the break room. We ate little. We could barely process what was happening. Some whispered about the vaccine we had received, wondering if it really protected us. I wondered the same thing, but I didn't dare say it out loud. As night fell, the hospital felt like a cemetery. Most of the infected were in a deep sleep. We took turns monitoring them, but nothing changed. All we could do was wait. We stopped receiving patients. The soldiers blocked the entrance, and only a few officers entered and exited. No one else. Outside the hospital, several people remained in the streets, waiting for a chance to be treated. It was painful to see some of them collapse from exhaustion, left to their fate on the pavement. I wanted to go out and speak to the families begging for help, explain that there was no room for even one more patient, that inside the hospital, the conditions were just as terrible. But when I looked at their faces, I realized words would be useless. Their expressions were full of fear and desperation. Others looked at us with uncontrollable fury, as if we were responsible for all of this. Some pounded on the doors, begging, but the soldiers wouldn't let anyone else in. On the second day, I befriended an officer named Bratt. We met in the break room while having lunch, and after a brief chat, he told me that they had also been vaccinated. They didn't know what the injection contained or its long-term effects, only that it was mandatory. Their only duty as officers was to maintain order. "It's strange," he said, frowning. "They're not giving us enough information. They brought us here with supplies as if they expected this to last for weeks. All police stations are requesting reinforcements, but the government is overwhelmed. It seems the situation is the same across the entire state." I asked him to let me know if he found out anything new. He promised he would. On the third day, the worst happened. The number of infected kept increasing. Even the relatives of the patients were showing symptoms of the illness. Every area of the hospital was packed with sleeping people. The isolation ward, the operating room, the recovery room, even the ambulance bay. We had to use the morgue to keep them there until we could find a solution. Then, a doctor reported something incredible. One of the infected in the morgue had woken up and was devouring those who were still asleep. The doctor screamed in horror, trying to reason with him. The creature, because I could no longer call it a person, turned with its mouth full of flesh and blood and lunged at him. He barely managed to escape the morgue and shut the door behind him. He ran down the hallway, desperate, shouting to alert the soldiers. 2 officers arrived immediately. When they looked through the small window in the door, they saw a horrifying scene. More infected were waking up and joining the feast. The stench of blood in the morgue must have been unbearable. Without much thought, the soldiers opened fire. However, the infected didn't fall immediately. They seemed resistant. Finally, they shot each one twice in the head, and only then did they collapse. The entire hospital went into panic. We shut the doors of all the rooms where infected were sleeping and covered them with sheets so no one could see inside, fearing chaos among the relatives who had brought them in. The security staff constantly monitored the cameras. We wanted to convince ourselves that what had happened in the morgue was an isolated case. It wasn't. The cameras showed the infected beginning to wake up one by one. As they did, they attacked and devoured those still asleep. We watched the live footage. One of the nurses vomited on the floor. The rest of us were frozen, unable to look away. It was a massacre. Some doctors and nurses tried to flee the hospital, but the soldiers blocked them. The order was clear. No one could leave. We checked our phones for information. The internet was flooded with videos showing the same situation, elsewhere. Quarantine didn't matter. Sooner or later, everyone became infected. Going to the hospital was useless. I looked out a second-floor window and saw the horror spreading beyond our doors. Outside, in the street, the sleeping ones began to wake up. At first, they moved clumsily, as if their bodies were still numb. Then, without warning, they lunged at the people nearby. Panic broke out in seconds. The crowd screamed and ran in all directions. Some soldiers tried to control the situation, but they were soon surrounded. The gunshots echoed in the street. I saw bodies fall. Some of them were infected, but others were civilians caught in the chaos. The scene was absolute mayhem. A man tried to help his wife, who had fallen to the ground, but one of the infected pounced on her before he could lift her up. It tore her apart with inhuman violence. The husband screamed and tried to push it away, only to end up with his neck trapped between its jaws. Inside the hospital, the soldiers' gunfire echoed through the hallways. We knew what it meant. The infected were waking up inside too. I looked at my colleagues. Some were crying, others were paralyzed. In that moment, I understood that we were no longer in a hospital. This was not a refuge. It was a death trap. I found Officer Bratt walking through the hallways. His expression said it all: exhaustion, fear, and forced determination. He told me they had received an order. The 50 officers assigned to the hospital would do the unthinkable. They would go up to every floor and shoot both the infected who had awakened and those who were still asleep. It was a desperate, brutal measure, but supposedly necessary to contain the situation. He assured me that once they confirmed all infected had been eliminated and that the survivors showed no symptoms, they would take us to a safe location under their protection. I couldn't help but think how absurd it sounded. What guaranteed that we would survive their cleansing? That was the last time I spoke to him. They locked us inside the cafeteria under the watch of 5 armed men. Some tried to protest, but the hardened look in the officers' eyes and their ready rifles silenced us. The operation started on the second floor. Through the cracks in the door, we could hear the echoes of the gunfire. Each shot meant one less life, but also one less threat. The sound of shell casings hitting the floor and the officers' shouted orders mixed with the sobs of those who realized that their loved ones were being killed upstairs. A horrified scream tore through the air when a man saw his father, still asleep, get shot in the head. In an act of madness or bravery, he pulled out a gun and fired at the officer who had pulled the trigger. The soldier collapsed instantly, his uniform splattered with blood. But his killer didn't last much longer. The other soldiers reacted and gunned him down without hesitation. That shot unleashed chaos. Other relatives started screaming that they were killing everyone, infected or not, and that they had to escape with their sick before it was too late. Some ran desperately through the hallways, pushing doors, slamming against the walls in a frenzy of despair. That's when the worst nightmare began. The doors to several rooms were forced open without thinking about what might be inside. By doing so, they released the creatures that had remained dormant until that moment. The infected woke up and lunged at those who had burst into their makeshift cells. The screams of the living mixed with the sound of teeth tearing into flesh. There were dozens of them, emerging with a bloodthirsty frenzy, attacking indiscriminately. More doors were opened. The officers tried to contain the situation, firing relentlessly, but they were quickly outnumbered. The infected, though slow, were brutal and unstoppable. What had started as an extermination operation turned into a massacre. From the cafeteria, we heard everything. The deafening gunfire, the agonized screams, the grotesque sound of bodies hitting the floor. No one could move. Some covered their ears. Others clung to the walls with pale faces. Even the soldiers guarding us seemed uncertain about their next move. When the screams grew closer, we knew we couldn't just wait. In an instinctive reaction, we began stacking tables and chairs against the two entrances to the cafeteria. We didn't know if it would be enough, but the thought of being exposed was terrifying. No one had the courage to open the door, not even to try and help those outside. The minutes stretched endlessly, filled with terror. We could only listen as the cries slowly faded away until the silence became heavier than the air itself. Suddenly, the blast of an explosion shook the building, then another, and another. We looked at each other, trying to process what was happening. Had the soldiers detonated explosives in desperation? We all waited in tense anticipation. More explosions followed, along with relentless gunfire. An hour passed, feeling like an eternity. We all remained silent. In whispers, a doctor told us to turn off our phones or put them on silent mode so the creatures outside wouldn't hear us. We all nodded, but before doing so, we wrote to our loved ones. I took the opportunity to check the internet, our only window to the outside world. With trembling hands, I scrolled through my phone and noticed something unsettling. Many links were disappearing. Videos were being deleted, accounts suspended. It seemed the government was trying to control the chaos by blocking what people were reporting. But we knew that was impossible. In hidden forms, information was flowing like a torrent. One message kept repeating, "Shoot them while they sleep." I wrote to my mother. I told her to stay inside, not to go out under any circumstances, to gather as much food as possible. I repeated at least 10 times that she must not leave. Every word I typed made me realize how dire this situation was. I sent messages to my friends, to everyone I knew. If you're at home, stay there. Don't go to the hospital. Stock up on food and water. Don't let the media fool you. This is worse than it seems. Some replied with disbelief, others with fear. I turned off my phone. The 5 officers guarding us tried to contact their superiors. The news was not encouraging. Reinforcements would take too long, if they came at all. We were ordered to wait until the situation calmed down. We resigned ourselves to our new reality, trapped in the hospital cafeteria, waiting for a rescue that, deep down, we knew would never come. The next 3 days passed in a limbo of uncertainty, fear, and despair. Food was running out, and the tension was unbearable. The silence in the hallways was overwhelming. How much longer could we keep waiting? Including the soldiers, there were 40 of us in total. By the fourth day, there was almost no food left. Outside, we could hear only a few footsteps. The soldiers told us their superiors were no longer responding, that they were now making their own decisions. They were on their own. We decided that the next day we would leave. After all, it seemed like the creatures had moved on, searching for prey in the streets, and if any remained, the soldiers would take care of them. We barely slept that night. Some hospital staff mentioned they were feeling unwell, that they had chills and numbness spreading through their bodies. They looked exhausted, as if they hadn't slept in days. The fear that we might be infected lingered in our minds, but we just had to endure one more night. Our plan was to leave as soon as possible through the main entrance, but given the explosions, it was possible that our path was blocked. In that case, we would exit through the back, with the janitor leading the way alongside the soldiers. We prayed that everything would go well. When the time came, several of our companions didn't wake up. 14 of them were deeply asleep. We tried to wake them, shake them, splash water on their faces, but it was useless. Their chests rose and fell with heavy, irregular breathing. Some seemed to tremble in their sleep. Others were drenched in sweat. They looked trapped in some kind of nightmare they couldn't escape from. It was a difficult decision, but we couldn't wait. We swore to send help once we were safe. We left together, following the soldiers. We did it in silence, only the sound of our footsteps echoing in the hallways. The air was thick with a repulsive stench, a mixture of dried blood, rotting flesh, and waste. Along the way, we confirmed our worst fear. The main exit was blocked. Large debris, remnants of shattered furniture, and bodies covered the way out. There was no way through. We quickly took the alternative route. Then, the unthinkable happened. I don't know who might be reading this, but if there is a God, he surely kicked all of us in the face at that moment. Up until then, the hospital was in near darkness, barely illuminated by the flickering emergency lights in the hallways. The air was dense, heavy with the metallic scent of blood and decay. Suddenly, a high-pitched, monotone beep cut through the silence, bouncing off the empty walls. Beep, beep, beep. It was intermittent, every 3 seconds, like a macabre clock counting down to something inevitable. It came from the speakers of the emergency power system. In the dim light, a red warning signal began to flash on a panel embedded in the wall. Then, a robotic and distorted voice echoed through the speaker system. Attention. Emergency power level, critical. Backup system at risk of shutdown. Attention. Emergency power level, critical. Backup system at risk of shutdown. The beeping grew louder. Some of the bodies lying on the floor began to move, not immediately, but with small spasms, as if something inside them was waking up. We all froze. "Shit," one of the soldiers whispered. "We have to leave now." We all followed the janitor and the soldiers, our fear growing as we heard sounds from the different rooms. Those things were waking up. At first, we tried to stay calm, but soon it became impossible. We ran. All of us did. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my temples, hammering with force. As I ran, I took a brief glance back. I saw some of my colleagues trip and fall. Their cries for help were swallowed by the echo of our desperate footsteps. Fear took over. Me, stronger than any trace of humanity. I didn't stop. I didn't try to help them. I just ran. Gunfire thundered down the corridor, like lightning in a storm of horror. We stopped abruptly, blood turning to ice in our veins. Several of those things had pounced on the soldiers, but this time they weren't as fragile. They didn't go down easily. I watched in horror as they tore 2 officers apart. Blood splattered. The walls. The screams of the fallen echoed through the hallways. And the worst part? Our only escape route was blocked by those things. Behind us, more creatures were waking up. Their bodies, twisted by hunger and mutation, convulsed before throwing themselves at us. A wave of despair clenched my stomach as I realized there was no way out. The sound of flesh being torn apart sent a shiver through me. I saw my companions fall, one by one. Stifled screams, bones snapping, bodies twisting under the monstrous jaws of those abominations. One of them locked its empty gaze on me. The skin on its face was torn, revealing muscle and teeth in a grotesque grimace. I ran without looking back, without thinking, only following the primal instinct to survive. I threw myself into the nutrition room, slamming the door shut and shoving everything I could against it to block the entrance. The sound of its nails scratching the wood left me breathless. I covered my ears, curled up in a corner, wishing for everything to disappear. And then I blacked out. I don't know how much time passed. Days, weeks. The hospital had fallen into a deathly silence. I was the only one left. The lights no longer worked. Darkness was my only companion. Sometimes, I thought I could hear footsteps in the distance, but I didn't dare check if they were real or just my imagination. I survived thanks to the supplies in the room, hoarding everything I could. But I knew I couldn't stay here forever. Someday, I would have to leave. My mother. Was she alive? Was she safe? I clung to the thought that she was. It was the only thing keeping me sane. I thought about everything that had happened, trying to make sense of it. Those creatures. They seemed to evolve. They fed and then slept. And during that slumber, they mutated. But when did it stop? At what point did they stop transforming? The answer terrified me. Then, this morning, the unthinkable happened. Distant screams shattered the stillness. Seconds later, a voice echoed down the hallways. "Is anyone inside? We came to help." The police had arrived. A glimmer of hope flickered inside me. I stood up, my legs trembling, ready to respond. But before I could, a massive crash shook the hospital. The sound was inhuman. A mixture of shrieks and growls in multiple tones. Something had awakened in the depths of the hospital, something I hadn't been aware of, something big. Its footsteps pounded against the floor, heavy and menacing. I peeked through a high window. I saw the creature illuminated by the soldiers' flashlights. The moment my eyes met it, I turned away, hid, and held my breath, praying it wouldn't sense my presence. The creature was colossal, at least 3 meters tall. It barely fit in the hallway. Its skin was a grotesque mass of flesh, with multiple heads fused into its torso. Each face seemed to be screaming in perpetual agony. Its primary head was monstrous, with massive fangs and multiple, dark, empty eyes. The soldiers opened fire. The monster didn't even flinch. With a thunderous roar, it lunged at the uniformed men. I heard agonizing screams, the sound of bones snapping, explosions. The hospital became a hell of chaos and death. Minutes passed, and new heavy footsteps echoed in the distance. Another being, just as massive, emerged from the darkness. But this one was faster. A man shouted, "Retreat!" And the gunfire stopped, though not the chaos. Those abominations had won and left the hospital, hunting for victims in the streets. The hospital fell silent once again. I gathered some courage. I've decided to leave. If I don't do it now, I might never get out. I will leave this journal as proof of what we lived through here. Sue Grant a hospital, huh? I've never met anyone crazy enough to take refuge in one. It's one of the worst places to be. Everyone brought their sick. Everyone hoped for a cure. Everyone wanted to be saved. No one was. Those enormous creatures. My companions and I call them Golems. You need a team of well-armed men to take them on. I had to use a small robot to explore St. Mary's General Hospital. Through its camera, I saw about 5 golems sleeping. But finding this journal and several doctor's notes made the effort worthwhile.